Okay, we're going to shift gears just a little bit. We're going to look at the rise of gay and lesbian rights that was happening along with the rise of feminism. So as the rhetoric of minority rights gained currency in the 1960s, gay activists demanded that society cease discriminating against them. When police raided the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar in New York's Greenwich Village, a crowd threw rocks and bottles, forcing the police to retreat. The riot lasted for 3 days and marked a turning point. Gay activists became more open and more militant. In 1974, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its list of treatable mental disorders, and the next year, the American Psychological Association decided that homosexuality was not a mental illness. The U.S. Civil Service Commission rescinded its ban on hiring homosexuals. During the 1980s, the nation confronted its most serious health crisis in decades. In the early 1980s, scientists identified acquired immune deficiency syndrome, also known as AIDS, a disease caused by the human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV, which destroyed the body's defenses against infection. The first victim observed in the United States were homosexuals. HIV soon infected the nation's blood banks. The government responded very slowly to this, and it wasn't until actually a friend of Ronald Reagan's, died from it, that it became this national news, and became, kind of got a lot of momentum in the government to try to prevent the spread of AIDS. A nationwide campaign urged safe sex, particularly the use of condoms. As a candidate for the presidency, Bill Clinton had promised to end the ban on gays and lesbians in the armed forces. When the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a number of important members of Congress objected, Clinton settled for a compromise known as "Don't Ask, Don't Tell." Some gay activists argued for legal recognition of gay marriage. Vermont became the first state to recognize same-sex civil unions in 2000. Massachusetts became the first state to recognize same-sex marriage in 2004, and within the next 5 years, 6 states passed similar laws to that of the 2004 law passed in Massachusetts. Let's back up and talk about moving from public communities to virtual ones. In 1960, people worked, shopped, met with their professional advisors, such as your accountants, your lawyers, your dentists, your doctors, your bankers. They went out to restaurants, they attended the theater, movies, or other forms of recreation in downtown business districts. However, 30 years later, by the 90s, many downtown business districts were all but abandoned, and many factors accounted for this migration to the suburbs, especially the white middle class, or that's known as white flight. The aging of the nation's population, it does have some serious economic consequences on us. A substantial portion of the nation's resources shift to healthcare and pensions for the elderly because there's such a huge number of baby boomers that are turning of age, if you will. They're turning 65, 70 years old. The growing population of elderly people challenge the viability of Social Security, and it's creating tensions between the generations. What we have to remember is that the argument here is, will there be enough Social Security left over at the end when all these baby boomers get through? Will there be anything left for us, the millennials? Really quickly, just want to touch on the first part of George Bush and his administration in the early 2000s. So this is the very last chapter of your book. We're not going to hit all of it, just a couple of highlights that I want to make sure you know for the final exam. So of course, this picture, pretty famous. I remember watching this on TV. This happened when I was a senior in high school. But I remember everyone thinking that it was just an accident, that someone had gotten off course and had accidentally steered a plane into one of the 2 towers in New York. It wasn't until they had it on the news and we actually watched the second jetliner approach the South Tower of the World Trade Center on September 11th that everyone realized this wasn't an accident, but looked more like a planned attack. And then we also saw pictures like this. These are New Yorkers that are fleeing from the dust caused by the collapse of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center following the attack on September 11th, 2001. So what we found out is that 4 passenger planes were hijacked. 2 went into the World Trade Center towers, 1 was flown into the Pentagon, and then the 4th was brought down by passengers. They were able to overtake the hijackers, and they crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, there were no survivors from that crash. And we found out that Al-Qaeda was responsible. Not only were they responsible for the terrorist attacks in 2001, but they had also been responsible for the suicide bomb that hit the USS Cole. And this happened October 12th of 2000, and it was linked to Osama bin Laden's terrorist network based in Afghanistan. A few days after this, Bush declared war on terrorists and nations harboring terrorists, and then we also had the anthrax letters that killed 6 and scared millions of Americans. So this was one of those terrorist acts that happened via the U.S. Postal Service. It was found that Osama bin Laden was operating out of Afghanistan, and so Bush demanded that the Taliban surrender bin Laden. And of course, bin Laden's the leader of the Taliban, and so they refused. And that's when we are going to invade Afghanistan. And it is a successful invasion. We're able to drive the Taliban from power in Afghanistan. But as you guys all know, we are still in conflict with Afghanistan. We still have troops in Afghanistan now. But we turned our attention away from Afghanistan, and we started to look at what was going on in Iraq. In January of 2002, we had crushed the Taliban, and President Bush declared that he would not wait on events while dangers gathered. So we were going to take this preemptive action, and he identified Iran, North Korea, and Iraq as the axis of evil. And he secretly initiated plans to attack Iraq, which was still under the rule of President Saddam Hussein. Secretary of State Powell is going to advise Bush not to attack Iraq. But in September of 2002, Bush seeks congressional support for an attack on Iraq. And then on March 20th, 2003, American missiles and bombs are going to pound Saddam's defenses. And the shock and awe was it was to liberate Iraq. So we had declared war on them in early of 2003. 15 days after the initial assault, the U.S. Army is able to seize the Baghdad International Airport. And on that same day, Al Jazeera, an Arab television network, televised footage of a man walking through Baghdad and saying, "Resist them, O courageous citizens of Baghdad. Our martyrs will go to paradise and their dead will go to hell." And the next morning, 800 American soldiers in tanks and armored vehicles blasted their way into downtown Baghdad. We charged them with harboring weapons of mass destruction, which they were not supposed to be. That was kind of the attack that Bush made. That was the reason for us invading Iraq, was to go in and find the weapons of mass destruction and destroy them. It was meant to be a very quick military campaign, but as we all know, it was not very quick. Although in May of 2003, just a few months after we invaded Iraq, Bush does celebrate and say that the operations in Iraq have ended. But it's going to continue for about 8 more years after that. And that's kind of the legacy. You know, Hurricane Katrina also happened under President Bush, but really his legacy was the war in Iraq. And it's not until we have this new election in 2008, and Bush has this tarnished presidency by 2008, and this election becomes very historic. And the reason it's really historic is the Illinois first-term Senator Barack Obama surprises the entire nation with his nomination for the Democratic Party. One, he's a first-time senator, he's pretty young, but really the biggest thing is he's the first African-American to win a presidential nomination. Of course, his campaign slogan, as we all know, is "Yes, we can." And His promise of change won him an 8 million vote lead. McCain was old, and he also really was disconnected when he said the fundamentals of our economy are really strong, and then the next day the stock market fell. So, it didn't look like he was really in touch with the economy, with the people, so he doesn't carry, and then he also chooses a very young running mate to run as his vice president, and Sarah Palin, who made it pretty well known when she got on TV she was not ready to handle the office of the vice presidency. So that kind of brings us up to where we are. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in chapter 32. I don't want to bog you down in that. Don't want you to worry about it. Just really quickly, I think it's important for you to know why we've been doing this all year long, why you guys have been with me for all year. Your book talks a little bit about why we study history and why it's important, but I think it doesn't do it a lot of justice when we start really talking about it. But really, at the end of the book, it's where a lot of the story ends, but your story begins here. Your story began in 1999 or 98, the year 2000, whenever you were born, and really it's how do you fit into the unfolding of all these events that are going on around you. We also want to ask the question, what can we learn from the past in order to figure out where we're going in the future? You guys have learned over the last few weeks, we've been in conflict with Iraq and Iran for decades, and we're still in conflict with them. So to understand that conflict and why it's there, and to understand what's going to happen in the future, or what will happen in the future, you need to understand what happened in the past. You're also a small part of this bigger picture, and I want you, as you leave this class, to think about what impact will you have on history. You may just have a small impact with your family, or you may get into some local politics, or you may become a teacher where you are locally involved in your city or your town. You may even go on nationally or internationally. So it's how can you fit into that story, and what large or small impact will you have? And then finally, this is what I think about our generation. I hear so many people talk bad about us as millennials and how, we take everything for granted and we have this sense of entitlement. But this is what I believe to be true about our generation, what a lot of people don't see. I think that we see the world differently. I think that we can create the change, and we do have a voice. You just have to be willing to step up and let your voice be heard. I also believe that we can eradicate racism within our generation. It's something that we really don't view anymore as a problem, but we embrace the different races and cultures that make up our generation. So my question to you as we leave is, how will you change the world? Again, this can be small scale or it can be on a larger scale. Don't let anyone ever tell you no. Don't let anyone ever tell you that you can't do something, because I promise you can. Have a great summer. Have a great senior year if I don't see you again. To those of you that are still in high school and those of you that are my college kids, good luck wherever you end up next year.